All right, let's talk about parturition and lactation, lecture at 6. So the hormone profile, we already did it, okay? And I'm going to write it out for you folks again, but I just want to remind you that birth, aka parturition, we need oxytocin, right? It's because we may not be ejaculating right now, but I already told you folks that the mechanism for ejaculation is the same for milk letdown, birth, all of those things, okay? So here, remember, is that if we want to end pregnancy, progesterone levels have to drop, right? And we saw that. We saw that because progesterone was being used as a precursor, right, for other steroid hormones. So remember, progesterone blocks the actions of estrogen at different levels, right? So here, as progesterone drops, that means that estrogen's responses can come online, right? And that causes me to have now more oxytocin and more oxytocin receptor, right? Now, another thing that we know of is I may have oxytocin binding, right, to the smooth muscle all around the reproductive tract of the female. However, as I have contraction and as the baby is growing, I'm also having the endothelial stretch, right? And so this endothelium is then also now sending signals and then also making prostaglandins in order for me to have more contractions, right? So this is an ongoing process, right? So some of you folks, if you've undergone pregnancy, you felt progesterone dropping and estrogen coming online, right? Braxton Hicks is when you start to have increased oxytocin and your myometrium is starting to contract. You're not going to give birth yet, but the contractions are there. It's because you're starting a prime for birth to happen, okay? Now, here I want to show you folks, right, is that this is an example of the positive feedback loop. And this is the positive feedback loop that allows you to have oxytocin release. And so here, what you folks are seeing is this is the child, right? So the child now is also growing and descending, right? And so as the endometrial lining is stretching and as the baby is hitting the cervix, those sensory signals are being sent to the brain, right? So it goes to the brain and I'm going to start to secrete oxytocin. And then oxytocin is going to come and bind to all the myometrium in this area, and it's going to cause contraction. And as the myometrium contracts, the baby is going to start to move further and further down, and I'm going to have more and more of the head pushing on the cervix, which then goes back to the brain and says, hey, release more oxytocin. And in doing so, I get now this summation of contractions that hopefully is able to push the baby out of the vaginal canal. Okay, that's birth, aka parturition. Now, let's talk about lactation. So some mothers, give birth and all of a sudden they have a plethora of milk, and that's great, right? But that doesn't always happen. And the reason is because prolactin, or the synthesis prolactin, you need to have a tactile stimulus. Okay, so the stimulus, and let's just put tactile here because this is a word we've used before, and that tactile stimulus is suckling, right? So when you give birth, the first thing that should happen is you should put that baby on the nipple, right? It's because what's going to happen is from the nipple, you're going to have sensory input that goes to the hypothalamus. And then you're going to tell the hypothalamus, right? The hypothalamus will tell the anterior pituitary to make prolactin. And we need that prolactin to bind to the milk ducts to make milk, okay? Now, tactile stimulation, in order to make milk, it has to be often. So you have to either pump or put the baby on the nipple every 2 hours. It's hard work, okay? And so, but the more suckling you have, the more signaling you have, the more prolactin you will make, which will allow you to have more milk, okay? Now, sometimes people think that milk is coming out because the baby is sucking. And yes, that's true. However, it's not just the baby, okay? What also is happening is because you're suckling, right? The hypothalamus is making oxytocin. That oxytocin is now being sent to the posterior pituitary and secreted. So this oxytocin now is binding to the myoepithelial layer around the milk ducts, and it also ejects milk out, okay? This is why you can have crying, right? A baby can cry. It doesn't matter who's baby, right? You can have crying, and from the hearing cortex, because the hearing cortex also feeds into the hypothalamus. Hear baby cry, hypothalamus is like, oh, baby is hungry, and then all of a sudden you're leaking milk, okay? It's because all of these brain areas are all wired in to each other, okay? So that's lactation. I make milk with prolactin, but I have milk let down, which is also called the ejection of milk, via oxytocin, okay? Via the same mechanism of ejaculation. All right, that is it for this lecturette. And people, we made a baby. We made a physiology baby this whole semester. You folks did it. We gave birth to it. We're feeding it. This is amazing, okay? So you've worked really hard. We're almost done. We just have one more lecturette.